So thank you first for the invitation. Thank you to organizers. And thank you also to all panelists. I think they proposed each very high quality interventions, and they gave us a comprehensive insight on the issues at stake for journalists in the social sciences and humanities. So I think it was very thought-provoking, and I'm a bit nervous now, so I will try a brief synthesis of what I understood of the different interventions. It seems to me that this intervention embraced the different aspects of what makes a journal in the social sciences and humanities, and also what journals make to science in terms of what is needed to make a journal, to make a scientific journal. What is the language of science? What are the translation practices? Why is there a need for multilingualism? What are the perspectives on this aspect? And also, we had the opportunity to question how we may access science via journals. How do we access science via the digital platforms? How is open access interesting to access science? Joachim Schöpfer yesterday gave us a functional approach to open science. And also, we could question the role of journals. We didn't really question it. It was obvious that the role of journals remained most important in the scholarly acknowledgement, in the career path of academics. We could discuss the role of peer reviewing and the circulation of knowledge. The role of peer reviewing being also questioned under the aspect of helping co-build science or building a better science. Because if the role of journals remain undisputed about sharing science amongst peers. We could also discuss the role of a community-driven ecosystem to sustain a more equitable journal publishing system. And the role of community was really stressed as the very important factor in this more inclusive approach to science. And last but not least, we could also discuss the way of economics and the dynamics of powers that are really underlying all these problematics that we could discuss. I will go back to these aspects in my own thoughts. Underlying the different intervention, I was thinking of aspects that maybe were discussed, but maybe not in such an explicit way. So I would like to go back to this or my own thoughts. So we discussed open science and we discussed open access. Open science relies today on the digital means that allows for the existence of open science. Journals are disseminated on digital platform, and it has a cost, and it is also an invisible labor. Maybe it's important for me because I work for digital infrastructure and digital platforms. To go back to that, I would like to say that in digital science, digital platforms that allow for dissemination of research, that allows for journals to exist, that allows journals and articles to reach peers, to reach a broader audience that we don't know in the World Wide Web. It was a promise of utopia, but it's also a real gold mine, and the main actors in digital publishing understood that it has a cost, and it can be a huge cost, and it's not taken so much into consideration. I did not hear this issue addressed as such in these 2 days of intervention. And also, it has an economic cost, and I think there is another aspect which is important. It has also standards, and it has an effect on how we will make science. Because today, if as scholars you think it's great to, for example, create a new journal such as Symbolic Goods, it's probably because you had somehow an itch that you had to scratch, because it was not there, and you needed this journal and this approach, this scientific approach to exist. You needed to be this team to address this approach and to organize yourself. And you mentioned yesterday, Severine, in your introduction, that you were eager to understand what you had to do to create this journal. What you know as scholars is how to write a paper in the social science and humanities. And you question what should be the language for your research. But if the form of the articles was built by scholars, for sharing research, the way it has to be formatted today depends highly on how research will be disseminated via digital infrastructure. And I think it's important to address this question. And also it's important because we talked about the dynamics of power. And these are political and ideological questions, as Carly mentioned this morning. I agree. And also it is a dynamics of dominance, and it induces a hierarchy. We didn't mention it as such, but there is a hierarchy between STEM and the social science and humanities. And there is a hierarchy in languages. And of course, English is dominant in the Western world. We didn't even mention a continent that is a main continent of power today, which is Asia. There is a huge amount of research produced in Mandarin, and I think no one amongst us know of. And and also in the way to disseminate and in the dynamics of power, again, there is open science and there is the digital path to open science. But I would like to remind that there is open access and there is go to dig in both open access. And that will be all for me. And I will leave it to Pierre for the final conclusion.
Conclusion of the conclusion.
Yes.
At least it will be just the final remarks for myself. So thank you very much, Sandra, and I just want first to join my thanks and congratulations to the organizers and the panelists of this symposium for this really thought-provoking discussions that we had the opportunity, and we were really lucky to listen to all of you during those 2 days. What I have to say as a matter of, let's say, concluding remarks from my side is is really close to what you just said, Sandra, and we didn't, it's not a plot, huh? We didn't discuss about it previously, but it's really quite the same ideas, but maybe said with my own words, that will maybe shed some light on other aspects. So the main topic of this symposium is about SSH journals, but what is striking for me, what has been really striking for me in the various presentations we listened to during the 2 days, is that they told us more, in my opinion, more about, let's say, the environment of the journals, the ecosystem in which they sit during their life, I would say, than to the journals as such as an isolated item. So in fact, we discussed about everything which is around the journals, as well as the journals themselves. So that's interesting. For example, Gisèle Sapiro, I just remember one very interesting thing in the Gisèle Sapiro's presentation. She made a relationship between the variation of scope of the journal and the variation of scope of the learned society. So there was this relationship between nationalization or internationalization of learned societies that has let's say, a consequence on the scope of the journals themselves. So it means that the journals are really linked to the institutions, and in this case, to the learned societies, of course. Joachim Schopfel, he gave us the big picture of the dynamics of the publishing industry with different dimensions, such as the economical one, of course, which is around the journals, which has a consequence on the life and the situation of the journals. Vanessa Prodman, for example, she insisted on the technical infrastructures and services on which the journals depend, and that's also a common point of my remark with yours, Sandra, and it's not by chance, of course. So, Carly Coetze, you did a very, it's really interesting the way she made visible the invisible work of researchers inside the journals. But what I found very interesting is that there is this approach of researchers under a specific profile or under a specific role. So it's not the researchers the way we are used to consider researchers as, let's say, researchers doing their field work and doing their analysis, but researchers as editors and researchers as reviewers under different roles. So it was also kind of a revelation of this invisible labor inside the journals. Björn Hammerfeldt made the link with the evaluation system around the journals and how the journals and the evaluation systems interact with each other, which also put in light or shed some light on the research managers, which is a different type of stakeholders. So those people who manage the evaluation system in the institutional or national, at the institutional or national or international level. And Delphine, of course, made this very important relationship between the journals and the languages and cultures. So you see, the journal is not an isolated item. Once again, it's something which is highly in relationship with a lot of different stakeholders around and inside the journal, and a lot of different dimensions. So some people consider the journal not only as a dissemination mean or technology, but primarily as a club or as a community. So what is a journal? Some people, some researchers say, and they published on that, saying, first and foremost, a journal is a community. It's a meeting point where you have different stakeholders coming together, discussing together, and working and collaborating together to produce knowledge, assess knowledge, and disseminate knowledge. So my first remark, or my remarks, would be to say that to gather the network you want to gather, because I understood from your introduction that it was your main, one of your objectives to set up this network of SSH journals. I think that one of the lessons we can keep from the different presentations is that it's necessary to include in that network the various roles and stakeholders which participate, in fact, to the fate of the journals and which participate to the building of the journals. So people who are involved into evaluation, people who are involved into technical infrastructures and technical services, people who are involved into cultural diversity, research managers as well, and all different types of stakeholders. I think it's really important. So if we try to reflect from that about what is a journal, so we said it's a community, but it appears from the presentations we heard that a journal is also a highly complex web of interactions and interdependency. And from my part, that's why I'm interested into journals, it's because I always considered journals as like the central nervous system of the world research, in fact. Because this is a meeting point where not all, but most of the stakeholders, they meet, they work together. So it's like a central nervous system for the research itself and for knowledge production itself, particularly in the SSH. So it's not by chance that we find different stakeholders participating to the building, the construction of those journals. And for me, this is the reason why journal is not dead. Contrary to what many people say, journal is not dead because this is an essential and a crucial meeting point for all the knowledge producers, the knowledge workers, in fact, collaborating to produce knowledge. And this is so. Yeah, maybe I'm going to be a little bit more controversial, saying that for me, there are some other points, so some other fora, agora, meeting points where the stakeholders participating to knowledge production meet and work together. And those other meeting points are institutions, universities, research performing organizations. And that's where I'm a little bit controversial, saying that for me institutions are a little bit less interesting than journals, because what institutions manage basically, and Bjorn said that to us, is the access to resources, in fact. So that's their primary function, I would say, to make arrangements and to select also those who are able to access to resources, human resources, buildings, electricity, network, and so on, documentation, and so on. And for me, the journals are meeting points as institutions, but really more focused on content itself, on research, on what we are working on, the topics themselves. So it's quite a paradox to see that after the Second World War, the research institutions, scholarly societies and universities and so on, they outsourced to commercial companies the production of the journals, which is, if we agree that the journals are a central meeting point for the research itself, it's completely stupid to outsource them to commercial companies, because this is a core function, you see? So here we have, I think we have really a challenge and something to do, which is for the scholarly community to take back control of the journals themselves, because this is their meeting point. This is where once again researchers as knowledge producers can collaborate on producing knowledge together and having control over that. That's really important. So my final conclusion from my perspective would be to say that it's really important to do what you want to do, so to set up this network, not to consider the journals as completely isolated from the wide array of different stakeholders participating to knowledge production, so to onboard, if it's possible, all the various stakeholders that that participate to the journal's production and should be at the table, sitting at the table, discussing with the researchers as well, and to build alliances inside this network to start changing a little bit the system.
Okay, thank you. It's an amazing conclusion. I don't know if we need more conclusions on this conclusion. But, maybe you have some reactions in the audience or among the guests on the video conference. I don't know. But I think that's focusing on the interdependency and the centrality of journals and taking back control over them is a very enthusiastic conclusion. And then, yes, I think we could end on that.
Yeah.
Okay.